Here's a question that's been bubbling about my noggin for the last week. When something horrible's coming up, does it help simply knowing that it's coming? So let me give you a trivial example, a more serious example, and then a Daniel example. So I went for a run on Monday night. It's a route I do fairly frequently, but it's horrible. I know that in the first half of the route, because Strava's told me this, there's 138 metres worth of elevation to climb. You're going up to the top of the Braid Hills. Now, knowing that it's coming kind of helps. I can pace myself, I can conserve some of my energy for the steep climbs. And I know that once I've hit halfway, it's pretty much downhill all the way home. So knowing something horrible's coming helps in some ways, but what helps more than just knowing it's coming is knowing that at some point it'll be finished. Soon I'll not be struggling and sweating anymore, but I'll be showered and sat slobbing on the sofa. A more serious example. You've got an operation coming up, let's say on your eye. Let's say that you've had a detached retina. The doctor helps you prepare for the op that's coming by walking through what's going to go down. Anaesthetic injections into the side of your eye, stuff poking about inside, time spent on your face for ages afterwards. Loss of vision for a while. Now, knowing what's horrible is coming does help in some ways. But what helps out more than knowing it's coming is knowing that at some point it'll all be finished. Soon you won't be detached and wincing, but you'll be reattached and seeing clearly again. You get the point I'm trying to make? Maybe another couple of examples, right? So knowing that your abuser is about to get home might help you mentally prepare or mentally detach for whatever is about to happen. And that might help a little bit. But what would help more is knowing that one day they'll be gone forever. Right? Knowing something's horrible's coming kind of helps. But knowing that one day they'll be gone forever is better. So knowing that you've got chemotherapy about to start can help you psych yourself up for the next round. But what would help more is knowing for certain that one day your cancer will be gone forever. Now, come to the Daniel example. We're in the final little section of Daniel. And this final section, chapters 10, 11 and 12, these 3 chapters make up one vision. Now, chapter 11 is a part of the vision that says something horrible is coming in the future. Life is going to be brutal for God's people. Chapter 12 is going to say one day all that horrible stuff will end. Eternal life, eternal peace will be guaranteed for God's people. Chapter 10, though, where we are today, lives in that horrible moment when you know the 138 metres climb lies ahead of you. Chapter 10, where we are today, lives in that horrible moments between the doctor telling you what's going to happen and it actually happening. Chapter 10 lives in the horrible moments when you're living between the brutal anticipation of something proper horrible happening. So we want to know it's all going to end, but that's not until chapter 12. In chapter 10, we're facing the horrible thing coming in the future in chapter 11. And chapter 10 is going to deal with the really important questions like, what do I do in the present to process what's about to come? What do I need in the present to persevere through what's about to come? How do I think rightly about the present to rightly perceive what's about to come? Or as you need to see this, chapter 10 is not about your ultimate hope. That's going to come in chapter 12. But chapter 10 is full of necessary help that's going to help us get through chapter 11 as we wait for chapter 12. And so what I want us to see is 3 things. First then, from verses 1 to 3, we're going to look at Daniel and see a man who reflects the situation of his people. Now at the beginning of chapter 10, we're given a couple of time markers, and they're important to help us get what's going on. So in verse 1 we're told it's the 3rd year of King Cyrus. And in verse 4 it says, on the 24th day of the first month. Now, they probably mean now to us, but if you do a little bit of digging on those dates, they immediately reveal that both where Daniel is and what Daniel's doing are weird. Right, think about it. The first year of King Cyrus, we've seen already, had been the time that signalled the end of the 70 years of God's people in exile. He was the king that wrote the decree that said they could leave Babylon and return to Jerusalem. So that was his first year. We're in year 3. So where would you expect God's people to be? Where would you expect Daniel to be? Jerusalem, right? But he's not. Verse 4. He's standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, which is in Babylon. Now maybe he was just too old. He's now in his mid-80s. Maybe he couldn't manage that long, wearying walk home to Jerusalem. But it does seem weird that although he could be back in Jerusalem, he's not. The other time marker says it's the 24th day of the first month. Now for God's people, that was the time they celebrated a festival called the Passover. And celebration is the key word. Meat and wine were 2 of the key ingredients. But what's Daniel doing at the start of this chapter? Verse 2, he's not celebrating, he's mourning. And he's not eating meat and wine. In fact, he's fasting from any choice food. Verse 3, including meat and wine. And he's not just hungry, he's honking. He's not using any lotions to soothe his skin or to cover the smell of his BO in the hot Babylonian sun. So when he should be celebrating, he's mourning and fasting. That's weird. Given the timings, both where he is and what he's doing are weird. So what's happening? I think, as is the title on your little handout if you've got one, that he is reflecting the situation of his people. Even though he's not with them, he is reflecting, he's inhabiting, he's participating, he's living out, he's a dramatization of the situation of his people. See, when Cyrus has said that God's people could return to Jerusalem, some of them did go home. There's another book of the Bible called Ezra, and you can read in the first chapter a list of the names of all the people that went from Babylon back to Jerusalem. But after 70 hard years in Babylon, and after the long journey home to Jerusalem, they found the city still lying in ruins and the temple still having been razed to the ground. So in Ezra 3, they start the hard work of rebuilding the altar first and then rebuilding the temple. But in Ezra chapter 4, God's people who had returned and start to rebuild immediately face opposition. A group of people deliberately set out to discourage them, and they end up so afraid, you can read this in Ezra 4 verse 4, they stop the rebuilding. They'd returned home in this glorious hope. But after a few years, Daniel gets news back in Babylon that they are deeply discouraged and they are frozen in fear. And so even though he is hundreds of miles away, he symbolically enters into their situation. Even though he's in a position of power and luxury, he puts himself into a position of weakness and poverty. He reflects the situation of his people. Now, if you glance at verse 12, it gives away more about what's going on. He's mourning and fasting, and it is about his relationship with God. He's humbling himself before God. He's praying, speaking words to God. He's asking God to give him understanding. All right, there's this instinct in Daniel that we need to learn, that when trouble comes to him, he goes to God. And he's expressing in that moment that he's dependent on him. That's what fasting is. God, I need you more than I need food. But as much as it reveals his relationship to God, this is reflecting his relationship with his people. Daniel is saying, God, even though I'm not physically with them, I'm so with them. He reflects their situation. Now there's stuff for us here on how we cope with those moments when we find ourselves cowering in the face of something horrible. There's an answer to the question, what do we do as Christians in the present to process what's going on when we face something horrible? And maybe we need this maybe especially if you're a new Christian, because the way you've coped in those moments in the past has always been a movement away from God to some kind of escapism, and normally something that's some kind of slavery and addiction. As Daniel mourns for this period of 3 weeks, he shows us that it's alright for a Christian to express how they're actually feeling. He mourns. You meet some Christians who, they always seem to have this happy expression on their faces, and I'm always so full of the joy of Jesus. You know, they've got kind of a Barbie doll expression that's always wearing the same smile, and you just want to punch it. But Daniel shows long periods of mourning, sadness, feeling like you can't sing in church, feeling like you can't lift up your head, feeling like you can't fake that smile anymore. That's okay. But Daniel does a good example because his mourning doesn't just immobilize him in his bed. No, it moves him towards God. See, sometimes all we do is mourn. And we need to learn to move our mourning, or allow our mourning to move us towards God. Before we were dependent on a substance. But fasting, for us, might just be fasting from what we depended on before. And fasting from whatever it might be is us saying to God, God, you are what I need. Help me. So this stuff does help us in those moments, push us towards God. But what struck me most this week is how Daniel identifies with God's people who are far removed from him. He enters into a position of need because of their experience of need. He fasts simply because he feels for their fears. If you think back to the illustration we did in chapter 7, even though the piece of the jigsaw that he's holding is relatively nice, he starts to live as if he's in their dark piece of the jigsaw. And it made me ask, when have I ever done that? Christians around the world right now, today, in this moment, are being tortured, raped, mutilated, killed for following Jesus. We've seen that as we've tried to watch Open Doors videos and read some of their stuff. But most of the time, I'm not just separated from them physically, geographically. I'm separated from them emotionally. We don't, like Daniel, take deliberate time or deliberately take things away to reflect their situation, to become part of their situation, to feel what they feel, to mourn to God for them. And if we've never done this, maybe we should do it. Maybe we should do it this week. Maybe this week miss a meal so that our hunger makes us identify with those believers around the world who are starving spiritually because they don't have the Bible in their own language. Maybe not wear makeup for a week so that the exposure of what we really look like exposes us to what God's people are really going through. Maybe not watch football for a week so that instead of my emotions being drained on something of no eternal significance, I can pour them into praying for something of eternal significance. Maybe deactivating social media for a month so that instead of wasting time in a world where everything's fake, I invest time praying about a persecution that's very real and asking God, saying, God, please reorder my emotions. Make me genuinely feel for them that we properly pray to you for them. And what I love in this is that Daniel's a proper wee preview of Jesus. As one who moves towards us to share our situation, who comes from heaven to earth to enter our situation, who becomes human to enter into our likeness. He knows what it's like for us to be tempted. He knows what it's like to suffer like us and hunger like us and weep like us, even die like us. But he doesn't do it just to share our situation, but to save us from it. He comes to the cross to take our sin from us, to become sin for us, to suffer death and hell for us. Makes me think of that hymn. He took my sins and my sorrow. He made them his very own. And then he bore the burden to Calvary and suffers and dies alone. See, the way to face these horrible moments as a Christian, when you know this is what the Christian life is going to be like, or this is what this season is going to be like, is not just seeing our ultimate hope, which we'll get to in chapter 12, but seeing this necessary help. It's saying actually it's okay to mourn, but allow your mourning to move you towards God, down in humility but up in prayer. And even to enter into that for others as Jesus entered into it for us. But as Daniel does this, I want us to see the second thing. In verses 4 to 19, Daniel gets a vision of a man who reflects the glory of God. So Daniel himself is a man who enters the situation, reflects the situation of his people. But he's then given a vision of a man who reflects the glory of God. So as Daniel's mourning by the river, he sees a man who's a proper mix of different things. If you look at verses 4 to 6 of chapter 12, there's a mix of linen, shiny stones and precious metals. There's a mix of lightning, fire and loud noises. There's a mix of things that make him sound like a priest, things that make him sound like a king, things that make him sound like a prophet. There's a mix of things that make him sound in some ways like a man, but things that then also make him sound like a description of God. Now, there's some people who think what Daniel, or who Daniel is seeing here, is Jesus in Babylon 600 years before Jesus is born in Bethlehem. I think it's possible. It's a really similar description to what we read a couple of weeks ago in Revelation 1. Other people, though, think it's but it's an angel. Because in verse 13, and we'll come to this quickly at the end, he seems to become overcome by some kind of demonic force and needs the help of another angel called Michael to help him out. And in some ways that doesn't sound much like Jesus. If I'm honest, I'm undecided. I haven't made my mind up. But here's what's clear and certain. Whoever it is who's sent to Daniel in this moment, they reflect the glory of the God who sent them. So what is God doing here? Well, Daniel's about to get a vision in chapter 11 that's described in chapter 10 verse 1 as a great war. A great war is coming. He's just heard from Jerusalem that his people are living in great fear. What do you need in the face of a great war and great fear as a Christian? Well, in the language of Daniel chapter 10 verse 8, you need to stare at a great vision of God. Here's the answer to the question. What do you need in the present to persevere through what's going to come in the future? A great war and great fears need a great vision of God. When your immediate future looks scary, you need to see God in his glory. And it's interesting that for Daniel, God is more overwhelming than his circumstances. God's glory in these verses saps Daniel's energy more than his grief does. God is so big that little Daniel can't handle it. As God reveals himself to Daniel in these verses, Daniel's like a tiny little egg cup that's trying to support the weight of a planet Jupiter. He's like a shot glass that's getting the contents of the Atlantic Ocean poured into it, and he collapses under the weight of God's massiveness. But actually that's what Daniel needs to experience before what he's going to see in chapter 11. You need to experience this, Daniel. God is too big for you to handle. But that means he's big enough to handle your circumstances. The war is great. Your fears are great. But God is greater. And when your circumstances and your future are too big for you, you need to know that they are not too big for God. And here's what I love about this bit. Although the vision of this man reflects the glory of the God who sent him, And although it reveals a God who is terrifying, he's so tender to Daniel. Although he's so glorious, he's so gentle with Daniel. So there's loads of words that kind of scream of Daniel's weakness. So words like no strength left, or face turned deathly pale, or helpless, or trembling, or speechless, or overcome with anguish, or feel very weak, or my strength is gone, or I can hardly breathe. Everything from Daniel is just a whimper of weakness. But everything he gets from this man is a share of his strength. Let me give you 5 very quick things. The first one, he gets esteem for his humility in verses 11 and 19. It's repeated twice. Twice he is told, Daniel, you are highly esteemed. You could read that greatly loved. You could read that treasured by God. When the future makes you deeply scared, it's important to simply know you are deeply loved. And your weakness doesn't make God despise you, and your mourning doesn't make God retreat from you. But when we are honestly and humbly admitting who we actually are, God esteems that. He loves us deeply. You know that today? You are loved by God. The second thing this man gives Daniel is, he says, is response to your words, verses 12 to 13. We don't just see Daniel praying in this chapter, we see God hearing. We don't just see God hearing, we see God responding, coming from heaven to earth in response. So when you feel like you're isolated and there's no one who cares and no one who can help, it is important to know that God hears and responds. Third thing Daniel gets, there is a touch for his trembling. Verses 10, 16 and 18. 3 times this man touches Daniel. There's intimacy here, there's closeness here. I know that for some of us, our fears have been so real in the last year that it's felt like a pair of hands strangling us. In that moment, it's important to know God is not repulsed by us or removed from us, but in Jesus he's come close enough to touch our lives and release the grip of our suffocating fears. There's a touch for our trembling. Fourth thing, and it's strength for weakness. Verses 11, 18 and 19. 3 times Daniel is strengthened so that he can stand. His weakness is injected with the strength of this man. So that when the man tells Daniel, if you look at verse 19, be strong now, be strong. He's not telling Daniel to do something that he's not. He's telling Daniel to be what he's given him. He's not telling Daniel, be strong in yourself. He's being strong in me. If you're a Christian and you're proper battling, you're feeling proper weak, it's important to know God doesn't ask you to be anything that he doesn't first empower you to be. And by his Spirit, he's put power in you so that when he says, be strong, you can be. Fifth thing this man gives him in his kind of glorious gentleness is peace for his fear. Verse 18. Although Daniel's response to the bigness of God was trembling, speechless weakness, God's response to him, verse 18, do not be afraid. Peace. He's terrifying, but he's tender. He's glorious, but he's gracious. And that's the whole point of this chapter. He is with you and he is for you. It's interesting, right? When I did those runs in February, the runs that were the easiest and the quickest were the ones when I had someone next to me who was on a bike as an encouragement. Surgery is easier to face when you're in the hands of a surgeon who's experienced and competent. And so there can be peace, even in the face of the great war that's coming in chapter 11. There can be peace in the face of that when you've got a great vision of the God who is with you in chapter 10. All the time and all the way through to your ultimate hope in chapter 12. Which means that for all our great fears, we need a greater sight of the glory and grace of Jesus. We need to remember that if we saw him as he truly is, we'd be terrified. Like Peter, when he saw it, we'd go, get away from me, because I'm a sinful man. And if you're not a Christian, you need to see this vision of Jesus. He doesn't need your strength. He sees your weakness. And you ought to be overwhelmed by him. To Jesus, we're like a wee virus that ought to be eradicated by him. But then you watch him and you see his glory displayed in grace. And you read about him in the Gospels in the Bible and you see him touch a leper. You see him raise a little girl. And you see him strengthen the weak. And you see him welcome an outcast. And you see him redeem a slave. And you see him release the oppressed. And you see him purify the defiled. And you see him cover the shamed. And you see him unburden the burdened. And you see him love his enemies. And you see him die for sinners. If you're not a Christian, you need to see him as the great Saviour for your greatest need. And if you are a Christian, you need to see your great fears in the light of this great vision of Christ. And by the way, if we are going to do that thing this week, which I think we should, and take some deliberate time, and deliberately take some things away so that we can pray for Christians around the world, these 5 things are a great place for us to start. To pray something like, Heavenly Father, may they see a greater vision of Jesus and know that he esteems their humility, he responds to their words, he touches their trembling lives, he strengthens their weakness, and he gives peace for all their fears. The man who reflects the glory of God. Final thing, and oh man, our time's pretty much gone. So very quickly, third thing, focusing on verses 12 to 14 and 20 to 11, chapter 11, verse 1. Let me wrap through this quickly. Final thing to see, a spiritual realm that rages behind the earthly realities. The question this is answering is, alright, how do we think about the present in order to rightly perceive what's going on? Now, all the way through this chapter, there's 2 realms, 2 realities that are interacting. So there's a man by a river, and then there's a man from heaven. 2 realms, 2 realities. Or there's a man praying, and then there's a God in heaven listening. 2 realms, 2 realities. Now that seems to be what's going on in verse 13 and verse 20 when it speaks about the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece. Prince there is probably referring to demonic spiritual forces that are at work behind the scenes, or behind what is seen. So there's actual nations raging politically, Persia and Greece. But then there's actual demons raging spiritually. 2 realms, 2 realities. And so somehow when Daniel prays for 3 weeks in verse 2, that's mirrored in this man or angel being detained for 21 days, 3 weeks, in verse 13. And so the 2 worlds overlap, interplay. There's a battle going on behind what we see. There's a battle going on behind what we pray. As one of my mates, I think, helpfully described it this week. This world's like an interrogation room. And there's what looks to us like a mirror that we can't see through. But behind it is another world. A spiritual world. And we can't see them, but they can see us. And in that world, there are spiritual forces that are for us, and there are spiritual forces that are against us. And you need to perceive this as you process all of this. All of life is a great spiritual war. It's reflected in what we've seen, right? The man that Daniel saw by the river is a warrior in what he's wearing. Michael, the angel in verse 13 and 21, also comes up in the Bible in the books of Jude and Revelation. And in wherever you see Michael, he's in a fight. In the Bible, angels aren't particularly angelic as we think of them. Angels are an army. We're in a battle. And so Daniel, Christian, you need to know from Daniel chapter 10 that our struggle isn't against flesh and blood, but it's against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil that are in the heavenly realms. That's what Paul says, Ephesians 6 verse 12. But you need to know, Daniel, you need to know, Christian, that having disarmed the powers and authorities, Jesus has made a public spectacle of them by triumphing over them at the cross. That's what Paul says in Colossians 2 verse 15. And so you need to know, Daniel, Christian, that the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. That's what John says in 1 John 4 verse 4. You need to know that angels are ministering spirits that are sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. That's Hebrews 1:14. And therefore you need to, as a Christian, put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you'll be able to, like Daniel, stand. Stand your ground. And after you have done everything, to stand. And because of Jesus, when he says be strong and when he says stand, he's not asking us to do anything that he hasn't first empowered us to do in Jesus. I need to shut up. Time's gone. But listen, life as a Christian will be tough. The run will be agony. The surgery will be uncomfortable. But in the face of this great war and in the face of our fears, we need to get this great vision of Jesus. And know that because of his glory and his grace, whatever lies in your future, like chapter 11, and as you wait for your ultimate hope in chapter 12, he gives you grace to stand. And you can be strong because he supports you, and you can have peace because he protects you.